Hello, welcome to Confessions of a Frustrated Game Master. I am Robert, the narrator, and thank you for joining me for another episode of Confessions. Before we get into this episode, I want to tell you that on June 1st, I started the pre-launch festivities for my high fantasy tabletop role-playing game, Peace the RPG. After 16 long years, I'm getting closer to seeing if the complete dream of creating my own tabletop role-playing game can be accomplished. So go to peacetherpg.com, Peace, therpg.com. Check out the setting, check out the mechanics, check out the game. You can go to the shop on the website and download the free PDF for the basic edition rules of the game. And if you are interested, if you see something that you like, subscribe. And of course, you'll get updates through the website. We are getting very close. So thanks for checking that out for me. So on to this episode of Confessions. When a game breaks out during your tabletop role-playing game. So a little bit of a cheeky title here. But what I wanted to come on to talk about is the terms or mechanics that seem to trigger players when it comes to a tabletop role-playing games. Now, I want to let you know that a lot of this episode is going to touch on my personal preferences because people like what they like. And one of my philosophies is, of course, it is idiotic to try to tell someone that what they enjoy or how they feel is not the way that they should feel or not the thing that they should enjoy. That is a fruitless effort. So a lot of what I'm going to talk about is just personal preference. It's not going to be much in the way of tips and tricks, though I think I have one. But again, when you're talking about what people like and how they feel, you really it's hard to come up with a trick or tip for the way that people feel, especially since it's not wrong to like what you like. So just a little warning there. Now, as a game master, a designer, and a player in tabletop role-playing games, I'm always very interested in how people lose immersion when they're playing, or the terms or mechanics that force someone to not be immersed in what they're doing when they're playing a tabletop role-playing game. Now, I have been online and I've been on social media and so forth, and I've heard players say things such as the fact that a tabletop role-playing game use the word squares when it talks about distances in a tabletop role-playing game, especially when you're using miniatures and maps and so forth, takes them out of immersion. Just hearing or the game using the word squares takes them out of immersion. Now, as that's important because obviously as a game designer, I had to think about that. And as a game master and a player, just around the idea of hey guys, what are we going to play? Something like that is good information, that simply the fact that the game uses the word squares can take someone out of immersion. Now, as I have said tons of time in the past, I love role-playing games. When I sit down, I love interacting with my character, portraying my character in almost equal amounts as I love interacting with the mechanics of the game. Like the title of this video, I am never shocked or appalled when a game breaks out when I'm playing a tabletop role-playing games. I'm here for both. And I have to be honest with you, as a player and as a GM, I've never played a tabletop role-playing game, no matter how complex. And I started with one of the most complex tabletop role-playing games in the hobby, Champions, the super role-playing game. I've never played a game so complex that when I just wanted to sit down in a room with other characters and portray my character and role play, that the game interfered with that. I've never played a game that's so complex that it intrudes on when you just want to role play. So I have always found it very easy to compartmentalize when it's time to role play and interact with other characters, and when it's time to engage with the mechanics. And I think that of all of the tricks and tips, or maybe the only trick and tip I have for this video, if you find yourself someone who can easily be taken out of immersion because of terminology that a role-playing game uses, if you can put yourself in the mind frame where you're compartmentalizing, where you can divide when it's time to interact, to do interaction, and when it's time to deal with the mechanics, maybe that could help you. Now, that is probably not a very helpful tip for someone who's complaining about immersion issues and mechanics, because the person doesn't want to compartmentalize. They don't want to separate interactions from mechanics. They just want the mechanics not to interfere. But as I said, this is a topic that is incredibly difficult to give a trick or tip about, because it's all about the feel of what you are doing. But it can be very important to address this issue, because it can cause friction in your group. If you are someone who is playing a role-playing game, for example, that uses the word squares, and you can be thrown out of having fun just because the game uses those words, then that can cause a conflict if the other players or your game master actually enjoys the game. So there has to be something that you can do. And of course, some of the advice that you get in the hobby is to play the right game, right? And play with the right people. But like me, I have made an entire YouTube channel from complaining about some of the things that I don't see eye to eye with my local group, and I haven't moved on. And that's basically because, number one, I am not under the false impression that just changing my group will make differences that I have disappear. When you get with another group, you can still have some things that you don't see eye to eye on. And I just don't want to go through the hassle of having to vet an entirely new group. So it's basically try to make it work, for me, with the group that you are with. So the only thing that I can say is, again, as a trick or tip for losing immersion when a game breaks out during your tabletop role-playing game, is to attempt to compartmentalize when it's time to deal with mechanics and when it's time to role play. Let your fellow players and the game master know that it is very important to you that you try to do everything that you can to stay in character and have those moments when you can have interactions and you can have role playing. And as I said in one of my other videos, where I talked about maybe it's not the system causing you to lose immersion, but maybe it's the game master, I always say that I, as a player, make my own immersion. I realize, as I said a couple of minutes ago, I've played some of the most complex role-playing games out there, and I have never been in a situation where when I wanted to interact and role play, that the system itself interfered, because there's nothing in the system that says that when you're role playing or interacting, you have to roll dice or you have to engage with the mechanics of the game. So try to make your own immersion if you can. And again, best practices is to play with the right group and play the right games. But sometimes, when you have an endeavor where multiple people, if you have two people, you can run into differences of opinion. So sometimes playing with the perfect group or playing the perfect game is not always an option. So you have to find ways to mitigate some of those feelings that you have when you lose immersion around mechanics. So that's pretty much everything I had to say about this video or this topic. So what do you think? Do you allow role-playing games to take you out of immersion? Can something as simple as a game using the word square take you out of the game that you are playing, or take you out of immersion? And just really quickly, one thing that I decided to do with my game is I definitely use the term squares in my role-playing game TTRPG, and the reason I decided to do that is because I love using miniatures and maps, but the game can definitely be played without them. And I just figure that the way my mind works, it's one less calculation. Using the word square, if you are using maps and miniatures, you know you're looking at squares, you know what they are, and you can just move your character. If what I did was instead always used terms like yards or feet, then in my mind, that's a little bit of a calculation you have to do when you're actually using maps and miniatures and using squares. When you tell somebody this person, you can move 5 squares, it's a lot easier. You can just make the move instead of saying, okay, you can move 25 feet. And I think that stops the minuscule math that you have to do. So what do you think about that? Does that make sense? Does the shorthanding of using the word squares and everyone looking at the map, does that make sense to you? Does that stop the little calculation in your head of, oh, so this 50 feet is this many squares? Is that a calculation that's worth trying to get rid of by shorthanding it? So let me know in the comments below. Thanks for checking out this video, and have a good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, whenever and wherever you're watching this video. Thanks a lot.